Okay. So it is a great pleasure and honor for me to have this introduction for the new ATA Talks online webinar. It's really been a while now since we had the last webinar. So the Atlantic Treaty Association would like to thank the NATO for its continuous support. To thank the member associations from 37 countries in the world for gathering again, being more strong and more united than ever. This webinar, we could say, comes at the right moment, just a month before the NATO summit. And today we will talk about the last NATO summit, just to remind how it was, what happened in 1 year. And that last NATO summit was very specific, held in the year when the international and European security architecture has drastically changed, and therefore a new strategic concept emerged. I'm Monika Begovic from Croatia. I'm Secretary General of the Atlantic Treaty Association, and I would like to welcome today our special guest, Dr. Benedetta Berti, Head of Policy Planning in the Office of the NATO Secretary General. Dr. Berti has a PhD in International Relations from the Fletcher School and is also Associate Researcher at the Center for Security, Diplomacy and Strategy at the University in Brussels. She is also visiting professor at the College of Europe and a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. It's a really extensive and rich biography, so I tried to really make it shorter. So I hope I didn't miss some very important details. So I would just like to also add that an Eisenhower Global Fellow and TED Senior Fellow, Ms. Berti is also in the past decade held research and teaching position at West Point, the Institute for National Security Studies, and Tel Aviv University, among others. Dr. Berti is also the author of 4 books, and Dr. Berti, your work and research has appeared, among others, in Foreign Policy, Foreign Affairs, National Interest, the Wall Street Journal, and the New York Times. I hope you hear me. This webinar, if I may just add also, will be supported and moderated by our expert in international relations, Secretary General Emeritus, NATO Parliamentary Assembly, and also Atlantic Treaty Association Bureau Advisor, Mr. David Hobbs. So just to begin, Dr. Berti, welcome again. Thank you once again for supporting our work. So please, if you would like to have your opening remarks before we start with our questions, and we really have prepared many of them, although we know your time is limited. Thank you very much, and here you are, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And also for the kind introduction. I'll keep my opening remarks quite short so that we can have at least a good 30 minutes for questions. So first of all, it's always great to address, to engage in a conversation with ATA. So thank you very much for the invitation. I think I'll go straight to the topic, which is what is NATO's new strategic concept about and why it matters to the alliance. So I know this is an expert audience, so I don't need to explain that the strategic concept is really a one-stop shop, and in other ways, a one document to check the pulse of NATO as an alliance. It's an agreed document agreed at the highest political level that basically tells us what do allies agree in terms of their common challenges, their common threats. What do they agree that are the priorities and the core tasks for NATO? So in that sense, it's quite a defining feature of the alliance. And the 2022 strategic concept was the 8th concept adopted by NATO. And I think that it was a very clear indication that the allies believe that we are in a different stage of our history, meaning that if you had 4 concepts during the Cold War that were very military, very focused on really deterrence and defense in the context of preventing a war with the Soviet Union, then when the Cold War ended, we had 3 strategic concepts that were really about much more a reflection of a more benign security environment, one where we thought that there was peace in Europe, that there was stability, and that we would face in the future more and more threats and challenges from our security coming from out of area. So in the post-Cold War, as I call them, strategic concept, you really had a broad concept of security, a strong emphasis on partnership, and in a way, the core function of deterrence and defense, of course, remained important, but in a way, the assumption was that the Euro-Atlantic area required a little bit less of that because it was an area of stability. So in that sense, I think the Madrid summit and the adoption of the 2022 strategic concept was historic for NATO because it is a reflection that we recognize that peace dividend years of the post-Cold War are no longer really, they no longer define our security environment. What do I mean by that? The 2022 strategic concept starts from the fact that we are in the most complex, volatile, and dangerous security environment for generations. It reiterates that because of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, well, we are no longer in a time where we can talk about the Euro-Atlantic area being at peace. And we need to take the potential and the risks of conflict, including affecting the direct security and defense of our allies, much more seriously. So in a way, it is a call for NATO to go back to its core function of enabling collective defense. And to do that, there is a strong emphasis on boosting and rebuilding our ability to do deterrence and defense. So it wasn't just a political commitment taken at the Madrid summit through the strategic concept. There were also a series of practical decisions to really help NATO accelerate the adaptation of his military posture. I would say, in a way, the military adaptation started in 2014 with Russia's illegal and illegitimate annexation of Crimea that really led NATO to start rebuilding its ability to do deterrence and defense, including with 4 deployed troops on our eastern flank. But that process really accelerated after February 2022. And in the strategic concept, it is we're setting a new baseline in which we're looking at how NATO will need to continue to be able to defend every inch of Allied territory. And to do that, we need to really boost our presence, thicken our eastern flank. And we also need to have not just more troops at higher readiness, but also more pre-positioned equipment, strengthen air and missile defense. There are a series of follow-on decisions from that high level of ambition adopted in the strategic concept. And of course, now that we're getting very close to the next summit in Vilnius, I think deterrence and defense and really implementing what we have agreed to do through the strategic concept and through the new concepts, military concepts that the alliance has been adopting over the last few years, you will see that in Vilnius, again, this is a very top priority for the alliance. And it's also reflected in the increased in the important emphasis on defense spending and retaining, building on the commitment that we had 10 years ago of moving towards spending 2% of defense, but now really looking at 2% as the bare minimum that needs to be spent to ensure a credible deterrence and defense posture. In the same vein, we're also working more on strengthening our industrial production capacity. And here is something that, of course, is one of the key lessons learned from Russia's work of aggression against Ukraine. Now we need to really strengthen our broad and transatlantic defense industry ecosystem. And again, we're going to have that as a key area of discussion and action at the Vilnius summit. So this is to start saying the strategic concept is very important in saying that we are in this much more complex security environment, recognizing that our relationship with the Russian Federation is completely different from the one we had in the last strategic concept of 2010, where we talked about building a partnership. Now, of course, we're not talking about building a partnership. We are recognizing that Russia is the most direct strategic threat to the alliance, and therefore we need to have a policy of deterrence and defense, of increased resilience, of working with our partners to increase their resilience, and of course also manage escalation through open channels of communication. So because of that the concept really puts a premium on the importance of rebuilding our ability to do deterrence and defense. At the same time, I think the strategic concept is also important because it recognizes that our strategic environment is complex, not just because of what is happening in the European theater, but it's also very complex because we are in a world of growing strategic competition. And that means that we see, for example, a deliberate pushback against the rules-based international order led by Russia and China, that we see more and more how potential competitors and adversaries are using both military tools, but also more and more non-military ones, economic coercion, disinformation, strategic corruption. So there's a lot of linkages between issues that we used to think as, for example, purely social or economics, like our energy policies, and our ability to do deterrence and defense credibly. So that's another very important point in the strategic concept. And of course, when we talk about strategic competition, we're also talking about China and China's rise. And it's important to note, this is the first NATO strategy in 74 plus years. It's the first time NATO addresses China as a systemic challenge to Euro-Atlantic security. And therefore, it posits the need for us to have a more closer transatlantic convergence on what this challenge is, and also how to build collective and national resilience, which is another, I think, very, very important point of the strategic concept, how we need to look more and more at a broadly defined concept of resilience, from our critical infrastructure to our energy policies, to how to mitigate strategic vulnerabilities, because these ultimately affect our security quite significantly. So in light of this strategic environment that is characterized by war on the European continent, strategic competition, fragility in our periphery, and of course also recurrent crisis being due to climate change, for example. And because of that, the alliance is really reiterating that it needs to be able to fulfill three core tasks. The first I already described is of course deterrence and defense, which is essential and underpins our Article 5 commitment to defend each other. So it's really the backbone of that commitment. So it's given, of course, a very strong role. But at the same time, we recognize that there are other types of threats and challenges that also need to be addressed. And that's why NATO also focuses on two additional core tasks: one, crisis prevention and management. And again, here, I think it's important to note we're focusing more and more on the prevention element. And that means very much the work we do with our partners on training, on building capacity, so that we can contribute to ensuring that they are able to be at the forefront of dealing with the security challenges they face, being countering terrorism, countering hybrid threat, or countering malign interference in their own countries. And thirdly, and that's of course also related to crisis prevention, we continue to be an alliance that strongly values partners. And that's why we recognize that we are in an environment with many threats and challenges to our security and to our defense can be dealt more effectively if we work with others. And that's why there is a reiteration of the importance of cooperative security, and particularly working with like-minded countries to uphold the rules-based international order, and really looking at not just partnerships in our neighborhood, which are of course incredibly important, being partnerships in the eastern neighbor or southern neighborhood, but also recognizing that there are regions further afield, like the Indo-Pacific, are also very much crucial, and security developments there can really affect our security in Europe and the Euro-Atlantic area. And in that sense, also recognizing the importance of continuing to cooperate with our Indo-Pacific partners, Australia, Japan, New Zealand, and the Republic of Korea. While focusing on all these issues, the strategic concept, I think, is also embracing a broad understanding of security, recognizing that as we build our deterrence and defense, and invest in our resilience and in our partnerships. We need to remain aware of global challenges that affect our security, such as climate change. And this is also important to note because it's the first NATO strategy that identifies climate change as a threat multiplier, a crisis multiplier, and an area in which NATO as an organization has a role to play when it comes to adapting and mitigating the impact of climate change on security. So in that sense, it's a very broad strategy, which I think sets the direction of travel for the alliance for the next decade. I stop here, so we have a little bit of time for questions as well.
Thank you. I will start, and David will continue, and also our president, Mr. Jim Townsend, is here, so he can also, of course, join us as well. You really very well described in this short time this complex strategic environment you talked about, and how NATO strategic concept is very important, and it's actually a contribution to Euro-Atlantic peace and security. What's also new is that the strategic concept added China and Russia as factors in the international system that are undermining this rule-based international order, I would say. So David, if you can just continue to this mind opening, you know, to our questions, because to be more active so that you can refer to our insights.
Thank you very much indeed, Monika, and welcome to everyone, particularly Benedetta, and I see the ATA President Jim sitting there as well. Let me begin with a little bit of housekeeping. The questions have just started to pop in on the Q&A section. Please use that, not the chat, because my ability to multitask is definitely limited, and I got enough windows open without having both chat and Q&A. So I'll be referring to the Q&A, so please don't use the chat for the questions. And if I can just kick off, Benedetta, because you've covered magnificently, actually, the scope, the purpose, you know, the challenges of the new strategic concept. And it is, of course, incredibly broad. We're looking now at 360 degrees, but multidimensional. It's an era of strategic competition, no longer a straightforward military challenge that we face. And of course, it's a multiplicity of actors, the autocracies versus the democracies and all this sort of stuff. So if I could just start with a sort of general question, given the scope and scale of this agenda and looking at, if you like, NATO's capacity, it is a little bit of, you know, sort of everything everywhere all at once. And there's got to be some sense of priorities. Now, obviously, some of those choose themselves, but does NATO have the capacity to fully implement, not all at once, but you know what we see laid out in this strategic concept?
Thank you. I think that's a really, thank you very much for the question. It's certainly something that we had, that everyone, I think, that had worked on the drafting of this document is very clear in mind as a challenge. Just because we are in a world in which not everything, but many things are interconnected, as you rightly pointed out. Does it mean that NATO has to be everywhere and do everything? And if the answer is yes, how can we do that credibly without undermining our core purpose, right? So that was certainly something we had very clearly in mind. And I think that there is the way I would square, I think the way the concept squares the circle is by, first of all, positing that in order for us to be effective on a strategic level, we need to be aware, and we need to be we have a global approach when it comes to our understanding of how, for example, security trends in the Indo-Pacific have a direct link on Euro-Atlantic security, and that's the first layer. Having that global approach and understanding, and making sure that we use NATO as a political platform to foster the transatlantic convergence on these global challenges. And I think here that's the level of ambition, right? If you move from understanding to implementation, and then I think there are areas in which NATO is clearly the lead actor and the lead implementer, for example, on enabling our collective defense through a deterrence and defense posture. That's our job. There are other roles in which NATO can have a complementary role. And that's, for example, on the climate change and security agenda. Here we're working with others. Here we're looking at how to work with our armed forces to ensure that they adapt and so that they are able to operate effectively in a changing climate. And we have a complementary supporting role. And then there's other areas, for example, resilience, where clearly we believe there is a clear role for NATO when it comes to understanding the issue, understanding the risks, understanding the vulnerabilities, explaining the linkages between, let's say, critical vulnerabilities in your critical infrastructure and our ability to do deterrence and defense. On that basis, we believe that NATO can serve a really important role in creating a common set of guidance and principles that then our allies individually or collectively through the EU, for those that are EU members, would then implement. So I think it really depends what we mean by NATO being involved. Mm-hmm. If we mean, will NATO be the one doing all of this, that's certainly the answer has to be no, because that would also, I think, rightly dilute our limited resources. But at the same time, I don't think we could afford to ignore some of these issues because, well, for example, the resilience, I think it's a clear case. Can we ignore the fact that our economic vulnerabilities and one-sided dependencies can be used to blackmail and manipulate us and could become security vulnerabilities at a certain stage? I think the answer has to be no. We need to be aware. We need to have guidances. We need to be that transatlantic platform to seek to harmonize approaches. But then, of course, the implementation will have to be national or through the EU and in different bodies. So I think that's a little bit this circle we're trying to square.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, can I just follow up on one aspect of that then? Because one of the real sort of innovations, of course, in this strategic concept compared with all its forebears was the inclusion of China. And a very articulate expression of the strategic competition, if you like, the strategic challenge, not a threat, they agreed on challenge, posed by China. And they laid out very well the nature of China's efforts, if you like, to erode the positions of democracies and assert itself, coerce, well, it's all there. But having described that incredibly well, if the NATO nations reflect what you tend to hear amongst the, if you like, the international commentariat or the international experts, there are still those who see NATO very, very much as a military toolkit and are reluctant to see NATO move, if you like, into these areas which are more related to strategic competition. And there are those, quite frankly, who say, well, look, we depend on China. You know, that's the most important thing. Our economics are intimately entwined. How easy is it for NATO, if you like, to transfer this clever and articulate expression of the challenge posed by China into actionables, if you like, in terms of dealing with partner organizations, and giving flesh, if you like, to the challenge of addressing the China situation?
That's a great follow-up, and I think it's also a good using the way. I think China could, describing the work we have done on China can actually be a good example of what I meant by NATO playing an important function when it comes to creating transatlantic, to helping to foster transatlantic convergence on some of these key challenges that are related to strategic competition. Of course, how we deal with the systemic challenges posed by China is, I would say, first amongst them, right? And first of all, recognizing that, yes, we have different starting points from different allies. That's not new. But of course, when you're dealing with a newer policy subject, it's even more complex to start to foster convergence starting from different national positions. But I think that the record of the work we have done since we started working on China in 2019 is actually a good illustration of the positive role NATO can play in addressing strategic competition within its mandate, of course, and within its competency. So when the work started in 2019, really between 2019 and the strategic concept, I think a great deal of the work was about fostering that shared convergence in terms of the assessment. And as you pointed out, there is a quite cogent, if brief, but quite comprehensive articulation of the different dimension of that challenge. That's an agreed political document, and that means that's certainly not a text that we could have agreed in 2019 before beginning that internal work on intelligence sharing, on building core situational awareness, on building expertise across the transatlantic community. So I think the work that NATO has done on this challenge has been quite important in getting us closer. And I think today, yes, there are differences in how different allies want to address the challenges, given the complexity of the relationship with the People's Republic of China. That's clear. But in terms of I think that I would say we are closer than we were in 2019 across the pond in terms of how do we see it? How do we see this being a potential issue for our security? What do we see our vulnerability points? And that a lot of it, I say, that is also because the work we've done internally. Now, a lot of the policy responses, as I say, may be national or multilateral through other organizations in their implementation. But a lot of the discussions, for example, on economic vulnerabilities and their impact on deterrence and defense, those discussions we can have here, and that can really, I think, help generating action at the national level. The other area where I think we have progressed quite significantly in addition to resilience and situational awareness, understanding, and intelligence sharing is also working with partners in the Indo-Pacific. And I think that's quite interesting to see how far we've come in our relationship with Japan, with Australia, but also with Korea and New Zealand. Again, working on this element that our theaters, our regions are interlinked in profound ways. So I think that's a little bit the work we are doing. We're moving closer together. And I know that outside of NATO, you have discussions about, is it about decoupling? Is it about de-risking? What is it? And that's a very important discussion. But I would underline that behind that, there is a commonality of assessment that certainly I would say was not there as prominently when this work started. And another last point I will make about how NATO's work can be helpful, and it's about indicating what potential vulnerabilities are and what potential requirements would be to mitigate those vulnerabilities, but also to ensure we can operate effectively. And I always bring up the case of the discussions we had a couple of years ago here about 5G and what does it mean for our militaries to rely on safe, secure 5G networks. Of course, a lot of the decisions were taken nationally, and different countries took different sovereign decisions. But I'm of the opinion that the debates we had here about security and about defense had a positive impact on taking informed choices when it comes to this very crucial element of our digital resilience. So that's a little bit the work I think we can do on these issues.
Wow, thank you very much indeed. I can see now that the participants' initial shyness has passed, and the questions are coming in thick and fast. If perhaps I could ask Monika if you could go through the questions as well, so that you can chip in and use. I'll select one now, and I'll keep coming in with others. But if you could take you pick the next one. But let me
definitely. But let's just ask Dr. Berti, how much time more do you have with us, so that we know how many questions can we serve you?
20 plus minus minutes would be excellent, because I have and that
okay, so 10 more minutes will keep you with us, and then
I can do more. I can do
okay.
20. I can do
Super.
20.
Great.
If that's okay with you, I'm
of
very
course.
happy to.
Great.
Looking at
Okay,
the list,
David, you
we can
start.
definitely keep you here for 20.
Definitely.
I'll just read one of the questions here and then leave it next one to Monika. Thank you very much for your insights. I have a short question in relation with the European Union. Shouldn't the relations with the European Union and the burden task sharing be stressed and explained more in the strategic concept, as we have only one budget and one set of forces in the member states of EU and NATO? The joint declarations are important, but not so visible as is the strategic concept.
That's a good point. I think that's some of the key principles of that relation are indeed laid out in the concept. I would say, first of all, recognition of the strategic nature of that relation, also a recognition of the import of recognizing and welcoming EU efforts on defense, but emphasizing the importance of those being complementary and not in competition with NATO, and the importance of integration, fullest possible integration of non-EU NATO members into those efforts. And those are important, and that's an important, I think, to answer the question, I think that's an important principle that we need to maximize our respective strengths. And given that indeed we have one budget and one set of forces, duplication would really be something that will leave us both in a worse position. There is no, and you're right about that, there is no clear-cut articulation of who does what, because that's very difficult to do. It was easier during the Cold War, again, because the lines were less blurred between the military and the non-military. But again, going back to the discussion we're having about resilience, these days there's a lot of non-military domains where, of course, NATO will not be in the position to have a regulatory capacity. That's not what we do, but in which we could not afford not to be appraised of those issues, and we cannot afford not to discuss them at the political level and not to understand their impact on our core mandate. So the lines are a little bit more blurred, and our assessment is that if you look at the future, they will actually be even more blurred. So clear-cut definition of the spheres of work, if you wish, I think are not going to serve us well. And instead, we're aiming for principles of coherence, principles of being mutually reinforcing, and of course, avoiding all unnecessary duplication. So I think it's recognizing that we should not be duplicating unnecessarily, but having a clear list. We do this, EU does that. It's going to be very difficult to keep to that list as the words keep shifting, and especially as our competitors do not recognize boundaries at all. They do strategy across the spectrum. So we need to be better at thinking through those categories as well, I think.
Thank you very much. Another question leads us to the topic that we already had quite a number of webinars on. It's disinformation, misinformation. Mr. Hugh Bailey asks, Russia tries to justify its invasion of Ukraine by telling its citizens and allies that it is responding to a threatening posture from NATO. So the question is, what is NATO doing to counter this misinformation? It's quite a big question, and I know it's doing a lot, but if you can just maybe summarize in few sentences, if it's possible to summarize this big task of.
I'll try, but I think it's important. We do get, I think that first of all, one important element of how we counter that, I think we counter disinformation from Russia, all the different hostile narratives on NATO, on the transatlantic alliance, on their war of aggression against Ukraine. It's a very important priority for us. And I think if my colleagues work in public diplomacy would be able to give you the full list. But part of it is about debunking, is about setting the record straight in terms of understanding exactly what the claims are, and then factually providing the data, because of the data to demonstrate that that those narratives are based on false assumptions. So there is a debunking element, there is a proactive communication element in terms of reaching out to different audiences in all our allied societies and we partner countries. There is also an element in which we look at public attitudes. We look to understand exactly what are different segments of our societies, what are their perceptions about NATO, about security, defense, in order for us to also be more informed and responsive. So there's different legs to our disinformation strategy. And of course, part of it also is about amplifying collaborations with other like-minded organizations. And on this, just to go back on areas in which NATO and the EU work very closely, countering disinformation is one of them, and also countering all the different and numerous false narratives that comes from the Russian Federation on what we do or do not do, and with respect to the war, of who caused what, and I think that's a very active endeavor. Of course, and I'm trying to be quick, even though this is a very, very complex question to answer. But of course, a lot of the work, I would say, some of the best, I think, deliberate communication that I've seen, of course, comes from Ukraine, who has done, I think, a terrific and really admirable job at understanding the Russian disinformation techniques, understanding how they manipulate the information space and responding. And of course, they've done that also to maintain support for Ukraine throughout the international community. So, of course, we're doing a lot, but in terms of countering the Russian false narratives on the war, I would say we also can look at Ukraine as offering a lot of best practices on how you communicate effectively with factual information in the midst of a war, and try to also preserve the openness of your society, which of course in a wartime is very complicated.
Thank you, David. Can I just read one question, because it comes from my YATA member, a young member of the Atlantic Council of Croatia, Dominic, who wants to know what is the current situation with the implementation of the NATO data exploitation framework policy. He's very interested in these topics. I know he's doing his research. So briefly, if you can just direct his thoughts.
Well, the best way would be to direct his thoughts to some of my colleagues who will be doing a really fantastic work. But for everybody, just to give a very, very broad answer, and if he's following the topic closely, then I'm afraid I'll keep it at the political level. But this is a very important breakthrough, I think, for NATO. When we talk about the alliance being able to adapt, right? Over the last few years, we're really focused on what is the role of NATO as a transatlantic alliance when it comes to understanding, facilitating transatlantic cooperation, when it comes to emerging and disruptive technologies, and putting us in a better place to advance technological innovation. And then has led to many initiatives. One is the one here mentioned about data exploitation framework that really will put us and is putting us in a better place to share information, to have a common framework when it comes to data, which, as we know, is clearly incredibly important when it comes to the future of our technological innovation. We're not just doing that; we're also adopting common strategies on many of the technologies we have identified as particularly crucial for our defense and security, from quantum to AI to big data to hypersonics. There's many, and for each of these, and adopting common strategies, again, a way to foster collaboration and convergence. And then we're also setting up mechanism to enable and encourage more transatlantic cooperation, like the Defense Innovation Accelerator for the North Atlantic, Diana, which is really going to promote the experimentation, adaptation, and adoption of technologies across the transatlantic community, and also tools like the NATO Innovation Fund, which is going to work critical critical startups that are working on dual use technologies that can be adopted to improve our security and defense. So when you put it all together, I know that my answer has been broader than just the data exploitation framework, but it's just to explain that NATO is actually doing a lot in this space. And of course, I would be happy if we had a little bit more time to perhaps provide more of the details, but I thought it was important to sort of frame what we're doing on this important topic.
Thank you very much. How many more questions can you handle?
I can handle I haven't read them, but I see it says 3. I can probably, if we take them together.
Well, let me pick one and then let you decide about the
okay.
other.
Yeah, because I haven't read it. So you know best.
Well, some of them are quite technical as well.
Okay.
Or more hardware oriented, but there's one which is rather delicately worded, and I'll make it less delicately worded. Okay. And it's about the wisdom of the language used in the strategic concept about aspirant members. Mm-hmm. And looking at this, it's really, I think the question says is, what should our policy be in view of obviously what we know about 2008, the Bucharest decision, and everything that stems from that and the various interpretations of it. What's the wise course, the wise language on Georgia and Ukraine in particular, I suppose, but other aspirants too?
Right. No, that's a very important question. And of course, the answer also has to be, I will start with the obvious, but I think it bears repeating that, of course, these are questions that are highly politically sensitive. So what the concept does is tries to foster convergence while without getting us ever to the lowest common denominator. And on some areas, it's possible to push forward a little bit more. In other areas, it's possible to push forward a little bit less, because that's not where we are politically. I think that the concept has a strong language on aspirants. I know that, and I don't think I'm saying anything controversial, that from aspirant countries, I've heard many feedback that they reacted positively to the framing and to the language. They would have wished for more. I've heard that. But I always say, well, let's see what we have in the concept, for example, on Ukraine. And I think while recognizing that the very understandable expectations to see something even stronger, but I would say let's not dismiss what the allies said in the concept. First of all, there is a clear recognition that free, independent, sovereign Ukraine is essential for the security of the whole Euro-Atlantic area. So we're already putting it in that context of saying this is essential for long-term stability and security of the Euro-Atlantic space, and ultimately for our own security and stability. Then we're saying, based on that, there is a recognition that it's incredibly important for us to support the Euro-Atlantic aspiration of our aspirant country through politically and through practical support. It is important to substantially scale up what we do when it comes to capacity building and training. It is important it is part of how we see our response to Russia to build not just our resilience, but to help our partners build their own resilience against foreign interference, coercion, manipulation, and of course on membership there is the reiteration of the 2008 Bucharest decision. This is where we are politically today. But I think that what we're seeing, for example, on the discussion that we're having right now on Ukraine, is that reiterating that decisions, we are also, I think, taking some practical steps to de facto say we are going to, through more extensive, through more scaled up, to more longer term capacity building commitment, we are de facto saying we are in to support Ukraine today so that it prevails as a sovereign independent country, but we're also here to continue supporting Ukraine to transition from Soviet style equipment to NATO interoperable, so that we're closer and closer together. And of course, remember, and we're doing that seeking to upgrade our political relation. And of course, on this, there's work being done right now towards the Vilnius summit. And as Secretary General said in his visit to Kiev, Ukraine belongs in the Euro-Atlantic family. And I think that's a clear message. That said, we do know that right now the political focus of the allies remains on supporting Ukraine today so that it can prevail, because of course, that is step one towards anything else. So that's why the focus, even in the concept, is on that. But that said, I understand why some our aspirant countries would have wished to see perhaps even more clear pathway towards membership. But I think the concept is quite adamant on reiterating where we are, but also pointing where we want to go. So.
Thank you very much, Dr. Berti, really. I think we are getting close to your time frame, and really thank you very much for your time, but not only for your time that you had, but more of your time that you gave to us. Thank you very much for your knowledge you shared with us on this very, very important development in the international security arena. And we are looking really forward to our future cooperation, because there are really lots of topics to be discussed. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'm always happy to have a conversation. And yeah, so looking forward to the next interaction.
Sure, thank you. And this webinar will be closed by the final words and views given by Mr. David Hobbs, who is an advisor to the ATA, Atlantic Treaty Association Bureau. And he helps in all of us to reorientate and orient it towards better cooperation among member associations and contribute to achieving common purpose, which is promoting and defending Euro-Atlantic values. So David, the floor is yours now. Thank you very much.
I will be very brief, because people did not come to hear me. They came quite rightly to hear Benedetta, and you've been absolutely magnificent. And I really hope that we can have another of these, because there are still a couple of issues pending. I had other questions emailed to me beforehand. There's an awful lot, and it would be fascinating if we could perhaps do a repeat performance after Vilnius. I mean, that's it's not in my gift, but looking at the boss, Monika, nodding her head, I hope that we can.
Yes,
there's clearly a market there.
Yes.
Let me just say that I was thoroughly impressed. I thought the new strategic concept really was the right document at the right time. I obviously, people got full marks for it. I know you deserve an awful lot of the credit for that, Benedetta. Now, of course, the fun starts, or it started a year ago, implementation. And I'm confident that NATO is on track with implementation. It can't do everything everywhere all at once, but those key priorities are being addressed. And I'm confident that we will see with Vilnius that NATO is on track, even if that track turns out in some areas to be a little bumpy. All that said, I'd like to thank our speaker. I'd like to thank my co-moderator, and you, all the participants who've stuck with it. It's been great that ATA Talks has been launched again. I look forward very much to the next one. Thank you all again. Thank you. Goodbye.